I want to welcome onto the airwaves now, and I've been looking forward to this discussion for a while. It's Emerson Brooking. He is resident fellow at DFR Lab, which is a part of the Atlantic Council. I'm going to let him explain a little bit about what that is to you, so you get a good overview of what we're talking about this morning. But Emerson, good morning. Thanks for being on the air with me this morning.
Morning, Dale. It's great to be here.
Well, thank you. I can't tell you how much I'm looking forward to this. I've been following the Twitter account DFR Lab for a long time, and I've read up on the mission statement from DFR Lab to talk about what happens, what your war is against. Right now you're calling it the infodemic, but it's about disinformation online. But I thought that maybe if you could take just a moment, introduce yourself a little bit, and maybe a little bit about your mission that you have with DFR Labs.
Well, sure thing. So I'm one of about 30 people at the Digital Forensic Research Lab, and we basically exist because social media has changed the game regarding mis and disinformation, regarding viral falsehoods and lies as they spread online. And our job is to track down these rumors and try to figure out where they originate and why they've been originated. There's a lot of people who share things online. They aren't necessarily thinking too deeply about it before they click the share button, before they pass it on. But quite often, when you see these falsehoods, there is someone behind them who's trying to mislead you for a particular motive, even if you don't know it. And one of our jobs is to figure out what that motive is.
That puts it very well. And, of course, you're a co-author of the book, Like War, The Weaponization of Social Media. You can find a link to that online. I sent it out just a short amount ago on my Twitter account. It's at @OneAirCoop. I'll retweet that on our official station page in just a moment. This is such a complicated discussion, and I want to try to make it, this is something that I've kind of followed and read up on for a while. So I'm not an expert, but I can follow the discussion. But and I've had some folks on the air before trying to explain this. But when we talk about disinformation and online, a lot of times the hashtag fake news gets brought over into the conversation. There's a lot of subtle nuance that actually creates these tiers of disinformation and fake news and stuff. Primarily what we're talking about with what you do with determining where these things originate from. Can you give me an idea of maybe something that is fairly well known from the recent past that people might be able to identify and say, oh, that's what we're talking about as far as disinformation goes?
Example a lot of folks turn to is the 2016 U.S. election, and the fact that we had Russian intelligence services and other folks working for Russia who pretended to be American voters and who took a wide variety of political positions online, but their intent wasn't to sell any one position. It was basically to sound as radical as possible on any side of an issue, and thereby anger real Americans and make it a lot harder to come to a political compromise. I'll give you one example that's always stood out to me. Down in Texas, the Russians succeeded in running two real-life protests next to each other. One was a protest in favor of the rights of American Muslims in Texas. The other protest was a Texas secession movement. And they had these folks together across the street from each other, and they planned at just trying to spark instances of real-life violence as these protesters saw each other. But that's how, bizarre this world can quickly get.
So this was not grassroots at all. It was not something that was commandeered by bad actors where they took it over or anything like that. This was literally something that they put together and just in order to create the discord. It was something purely for that purpose and not something that was stolen from somebody else or something like that. It was actually put together for this purpose.
That's right. But it was all real Americans who showed up.
Right.
What the Russians did in 2016, what any of these disinformation actors do, is they look for the seed of a real issue that people care about, but then they twist and manipulate it. They try to blow it out of proportion, and they try to co-opt it for their own purposes. Because, again, the Russians didn't care about secession. They didn't care about the rights of American Muslims. They just wanted people to clash, and they wanted it in that case because they wanted to weaken the U.S. and to weaken our political stability.
One of the things in retrospect and looking back on 2016 that I really wish could have happened is that there could have been some adults in the room to have the discussion on a nonpartisan basis, because the moment that any side, but the moment that a story finds a home with a political party, regardless of who it is or what the story is, once it finds a home with that political party, the other side's going to push back as hard as they possibly can, even to the point of cognitive dissonance where it doesn't make any sense to push back. And I feel like that's what happened with the story of the 2016 election. There is massive amounts of data and proof that shows what's happened, not only in work that various government agencies have done, but in the work that you've done. I mean, I followed along a lot of the things that you guys helped unearth, and you found the origins of certain movements and stuff like that. And these are things that are trackable. They're not unknowable, and it's a discussion that we could have as an American people, but we have to be a little bit more mature and get out of the political atmosphere and talking about it. It really annoys me when the moment that a story surfaces either on the right or the left of an issue, the other side completely just wants to debunk it instead of trying to figure out what is proper about that story to discuss.
Yeah, absolutely. And well, one of the big problems we encounter, like if you look back to 2016, this messaging, it did hit all sides of the political spectrum, but it did generally help the campaign of President Trump.
Sure.
And then there was evidence of this Russian interference prior to the election day. Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, Republican Majority Leader, kind of understandably did not want a public statement by the U.S. government about this stuff because he said it would be inherently political. So just to play the devil's advocate a bit, this stuff is so close to politics that it is often very difficult to disentangle. And that's one of the biggest challenges we've come across. Back in 2016, we weren't really following disinformation and social media manipulation. Now we are. I think we've gotten a lot better at talking about it, but it's still tough to separate it from these hot-button political issues, and it still gets people's tensions boiling.
Yeah, and that's what you found. You mentioned about, and even what I talked about in asking that question and what you just mentioned there, we talk about those as results, but that really was the intent of this to begin with. These bad actors know what they're doing, so they know, even if we're not talking about constitutional law in the United States, we're talking about precedent and things that we do in more or less a polite society, the things that there may not be before 2016 anyway. A lot of the times there's no law against doing that, but we just don't do that because of precedent, historical perspective, whatever it might be. So there's certain things we don't talk about. We don't, we give at least the veneer of not politicizing certain things. And I believe that was taken advantage of. Kind of our shyness to talk about these things as they're happening, I think really played into the hands of the bad actors that were doing this. I wondered if you could talk for a moment about your work as far as tracing this stuff back, and how somebody who is just open, I mean, online is just an open filter. I try to curate the sources that I get news from. I hardly use any of the mass media sources because usually what they do are rewrites. They're not specialists, and I try to go to the specialists. But what can people do to kind of guard themselves, to steel themselves against disinformation campaigns?
Mm-hmm. Well, first, what you just said really illustrates just how social media has made all this stuff possible, right? We've always had bad actors who maybe tried to mislead people. But it's our new technologies that enable, a group of Macedonians or a group of Indians hired by somebody to masquerade as American and steer the conversation in one direction or another. As everyday Americans, but as active Internet users, biggest piece of advice I have is to, every time you see a story, especially a story that is a little bit salacious, a story that is juicy, seems almost too good to be true, or a little bit out there, stop a minute and think about who would stand to benefit if that story was shared. Try to click on the story. 60% of people don't click stories they share on Facebook. That's the number one problem.
Right.
So if you're about to share something to all your friends, take a minute, click on it, read it or watch it, kind of look around that website and see if they're on the straight and narrow, or see if they have some sort of motive, whether it's a financial incentive or a political motive, in which they want you to share that piece of information. because that's really our collective responsibility as online American citizens. Because this information environment really is pretty polluted now, as these instances of false news, of mis and disinformation accumulate, and it is our collective responsibility to try to bring that down a little bit and to try to shield people.
Emerson Brooking is with me this morning, resident fellow at DFR Labs, forensic investigators into misinformation online. You can follow their work. There's a hashtag. It's hashtag Digital Sherlocks online, hashtag Digital Sherlocks, if you want to just follow the narrative of some of this stuff. And just a couple more minutes with Emerson this morning. A busy guy, and I'm really grateful for the time that we've had this morning. One of the last things I wanted to ask you about, first of all, with disinformation, sometimes this makes it into quote-unquote mainstream media. You'll see it parked on where somebody will pick it up as some sort of a rewrite or something. That does happen from time to time, right, where it does enter into the main stratosphere of our news?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and a big reason that happens is because all of our journalists are online.
Yeah.
Extremely online. I think it's 98% of U.S. journalists have a Twitter account. And they're on there all the time. I think only about 20% of Americans overall have a Twitter account. So these online media really biases toward the elite. And they often, even if they don't realize it, whenever they see these pieces of mis and disinformation, it is kind of shifting their perspective. And it affects what they end up sharing on their broadcasts, whether it's radio or television, to other audiences later.
If you're somebody that can... Oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
So what I'm getting at here, then, is even if your listeners aren't on Facebook all the time, even if they don't have a Twitter account, you're still being affected by this discourse. It is reaching you indirectly.
Because the output is being influenced, and so you're trying to silo yourself, but you can't necessarily because of the outside influences to those things that you're trying to get to. And so it is kind of an effect that it's hard to isolate yourself from. Is one of the I guess from the bad actors that do this, the added benefits for us, it's certainly not a benefit, but where you get so much disinformation out there and people push back, there's all kinds of, fact checkers and different things like that, which now there's a war on fact checking, and this fact checking is liberal and this fact checking is conservative, and it goes back and forth and back and forth. But that's one of the benefits for the bad actors anyway, is that surfacing disinformation and creating kind of this crossover with the hashtag fake news movement and everything else really makes it easy for somebody who's kind of emotionally engaged in a story to dismiss or to accept something without much critical thought at all. It's really easy to say, I don't like that, hashtag fake news, and then just move on. That's
right. And this is a high-dollar word, but it's one of my very favorites, which I learned when I was writing my book. And this is called homophily, love of the same. And the idea is that we have a particular network of friends and acquaintances. We have those friends and acquaintances in part because we might have a similar view of the world. Over time, as you're sharing information in that network that has a particular political perspective or perspective on issues, all of you can begin to kind of reach a consensus on a certain kind of truth. And the truth of your network can gradually drift quite far away from the truth of another network. But because we're most connected to people who share our points of view, we don't necessarily realize that our realities are drifting away from each other. And that means oftentimes when you're in one reality and you meet a group of Americans who are in another reality, you can get quite angry and frustrated because you know the truth. You can't understand why they don't see the same truth that you do.
Oh. Man, this is such thoughtful discourse, and I wish that we could do a series of shows, to be honest with you, because there's so much here that I would love to unearth. Emerson, I'm going to ask you one last question in parting, and I appreciate your time this morning. We've been talking a lot, obviously, the story that permeates everything right now with the coronavirus and COVID-19. Unfortunately, with something that's such a big story, that means there's also a ton of disinformation that's feeding that story. And I wondered before we cut you loose from the airways this morning, if you could maybe give the listening audience a little bit of an idea of some of the disinformation that you're seeing out there that you've been aware of since this story started to break.
Well, sure thing. And Dale, I've been studying disinformation since it was used by terrorist groups in 2012. We talked about this political manipulation, but some of the most dangerous stuff I've seen regards COVID-19 and this coronavirus stuff now. I want to just real quickly highlight three things that are spreading widely but are not true. First is the idea that quarantining and your self-isolation is unhealthy because your immune system weakens if you spend too much time indoors. I've seen that bounce around Facebook a lot. That is not true. Second thing is that there are a number of cures that are being tested right now for coronavirus, and you hear a lot about hydroxychloroquine, but we still have no concrete evidence that it works. It does work for other ailments, and unfortunately, so many people want the drug right now that the people who really could use it can't get it anymore. And then the final thing, which is most in our wheelhouse and I think most troubling, we have new public opinion polling out that about a quarter of Americans believe that this coronavirus is a foreign bioweapon, that it was created in the lab. And on the flip side, we know that about half, a rough estimate, about half of Chinese citizens think that the coronavirus is an American bioweapon. This is a problem because it's not true. We don't know exactly how coronavirus originated, but we know it originated through the same evolutionary process as these other viral strains. It was not a bioweapon.
And there's a huge, I'm sorry, I was just going to say there's a huge argument where you can show that just by, it's not a very effective bioweapon, honestly, if that's what the point of it was supposed to be. But anyway, I didn't mean to cut you off. Go ahead.
No, that's a great point. If you're making a bioweapon, you'd make a much better one. But I just really want to hammer that home for folks because one of the greatest dangers coming out of this is that we have a number of governments that haven't done a very good response to the coronavirus pandemic. And these governments, the Chinese, Iranians, Russians, and even the U.S. a little bit, they're looking for other people to blame. And that's going to ratchet up tensions around the world. So I just want your listeners to know that this is a natural pandemic. It's a great tragedy, but there's no single person responsible. But it's our collective job to fight it as best we can.
An absolute a great conversation that I have had this morning with Emerson Brooking, resident fellow at DFR Labs, part of the Atlantic Council, talking about disinformation in general online, but towards the end here, dialing down on the COVID-19 pandemic. Emerson, thank you so much for your time this morning. I wish we could go on forever, but maybe I'll have you back on sometime soon. We'll do a follow-up and do a deep dive into some more issues.
Me too. This was great. Thank you, Dale.
Thank you for your time. I really appreciate that. That is Emerson Brooking, and I really encourage you to follow him online. You can do so online. It's E.T. Brooking. That's at E.T. Brooking if you go on Twitter.